The Big 12 is going to be adding 4 new teams this season. You got UCF, Cincinnati, Houston, and BYU. And out of these 4 new teams, which one do you guys think is going to have the most success this season? You look at UCF, I think that they probably are going to be my pick, simply for the fact that I think they have the most proven head coach that enters this conference, and Gus Malzahn. He had a good amount of success at Auburn. He had a pretty successful season last year at UCF. They went 9-5. Yeah, they lost in the AAC Championship game to Tulane, but for the most part, this team returns a lot of talent. They return 6 starters on offense, 6 on defense. That's 12 in total. They have John Rhys Plumlee at quarterback. He's one of the better dual threat QBs that we have in college football right now. And when you look at the strength of their team, you got to look at the talent that they're bringing up front on the defensive line. They have 2 really good defensive ends. Their front 7 is fantastic. My only concern about UCF is going to be how is their secondary going to hold up in a more talented Pac-12 when you're going to have teams like Texas, Oklahoma that are going to be able to have success throwing the football at a really efficient level. You're playing against Dylan Gabriel, Quinn Ewers. So it is going to be a step up in competition. I'm really excited to see how UCF is going to handle the spike in comp. We've seen in the past that UCF has been more than capable of being able to handle themselves amongst the big boys in college football. But this is going to be something different, because this just isn't going to be a one-off game like how UCF is accustomed to playing in bowl season. They're going to be playing against a lot of good Pac-12 teams this year, but I think that this team is equipped to have a lot of success going into the 2023 season, joining the Big 12 Conference. You look at Cincinnati, I think they probably will be the worst of the 4 new teams. They lost Luke Fickell, who weirdly left for Wisconsin. I don't know what the hell was up there in Wisconsin that had him so entrenched to leave Cincinnati, but he left, and they replaced him with Scott Satterfield, who left Louisville to go coach up there for the Bearcats. And Scott Satterfield, it was a really odd situation that he was dealing with up there in Louisville. I don't want to say he was bad, but he wasn't all that great. And as a matter of fact, for the majority of last season, he was pretty much on the hot seat, but he was able to get things turned around, and Louisville had a pretty good season. They don't really have a lot of returning starters, which really concerns me. They do have Emory Jones at quarterback. I'm still rooting for Emory Jones. I've been watching this guy ever since I was a freshman at high school. I'm still hoping that this guy can end up finding a way to having a serviceable or at least a really productive season this year if he does get the start for the Bearcats this year. Their offensive line is really shaky, even though they did hit the transfer portal pretty hard when it came to addressing that area. They got 3 transfer portal offensive linemen who are expected to start this season. Their defense isn't really all that great, even though they do return more starters on defense than they do offense. But I think their secondary could be a major concern. And you're going into a Big 12 conference that's going to have some really good offenses, some pretty good quarterback play, and not just worry about how Cincinnati is going to perform on defense. And not just on defense, but when you look at their roster overall, they don't really have a lot of experience. It's a pretty inexperienced group that Scott Satterfield is going to have going into this season, and there isn't too much proven talent. So I think Cincinnati could be in for a really rough year. Now, Houston is a team that I was really close to picking over UCF. And you may look at Houston and be like, the Cougars, JT? Didn't they just lose their 2 best players in quarterback Clayton and Tank Dell to the NFL? Yes, they did, but if you talk to Dana Holgorsen, he feels like this is his best wide receiving core that he's had in all of his years coaching. Despite the fact that he's losing Tank Dell, who is one of the best receivers in college football. Don't sleep on Donovan Smith, who is expected to get the start at quarterback this year. He's a transfer from Texas Tech. This guy reminds me a lot of Anthony Richardson. He's not as athletic as Anthony Richardson, but he has a lot of similarities to him. He has really good size, pretty good athlete. He has a really live arm. He can really push the ball downfield. And I think in Dana Holgerson's offense, you could definitely see him having a big season this year. And you're going to need really exceptional quarterback play if you are Dana Holgerson and the Houston Cougars going up into the Big 12 Conference, which is going to be way better than what you were facing in the American last year. And if you want to be able to have a good start in this conference, you need to have good QB play. The offensive line is going to be pretty good. This is probably going to be the best offensive line out of the 4 teams that are new to this conference. They return a good amount of experience. They have some really good players at offensive tackle. Their running back room is solid, even though one of their key running backs ended up transferring out, and now he joins Coach Prime at Colorado. My biggest area of concern for Houston is the defense. I'm not expecting Houston to have any good defense at all this year. So if they want to end up making it to a bowl game, they're pretty much going to have to outscore every single body that they play in this conference, because defense is pretty much non-existent when it comes to this team. I don't really think it's going to improve all that much. And if it does, I don't really think it's going to be a dramatic improvement for them. And BYU, under head coach Kalani Sitake, they went 8-5 last year. Normally, this is a pretty consistent program, but going into this year, they're just in a little bit of a rut when it comes to their roster. They returned 7 starters on defense, but their defense was one of the worst in college football last year. They do bring in a new defensive coordinator and Jay Hill. Plus, he was able to bring in one of his best players from Weber State and cornerback Eddie Heckert, who was one of the better cornerbacks playing for him when he was the coach there. You do have Jaden Dunlap, who is a JUCO transfer, who I feel was pretty solid. Kalani Sitake talked about him. He felt like he was one of the more underrated JUCO cornerbacks. He thinks that both of these two guys are going to have a really big impact on this secondary this season. But this defense is a huge concern. They're losing their starting quarterback, Jaron Hall, to the NFL. They're going to be replacing him with Kendon Slovis. That's just the prime example of how ridiculous the transfer portal is. Kendon Slovis has been passed around more than a hot potato. This man has jumped from USC, the Pitt, to now at BYU. I wonder where he's going to go next if he doesn't have success at BYU. The offensive line has been a huge area of concern for BYU fans, but a lot of coaches on this staff have a lot of confidence that this offensive line not only is going to be really good, but it's going to be even better than what it was last season. Their wide receiver core doesn't have too much depth. They do return 2 pretty good starters, but if one of those guys goes down, they're going to be in a lot of trouble. They get Aiden Robbins from the transfer portal. He's a UNLV transfer. He's your typical BYU kind of running back. He's big, really physical, hard to bring down. If you want to try to wrap this guy up high, he's going to run through you. He has a really high motor. BYU isn't going to be one of those Big 12 teams that are going to be fun to watch offensively. They're going to be pretty boring to watch. If you're somebody who's a fan of big plays in the passing game, you're not going to get that out of BYU. This is a program that's predicated on playing physical football. They want to be able to ground and pound you to the mud. And some of these Big 12 teams may be in a little bit of trouble when they play BYU this year, because this conference doesn't really have a lot of great defensive line play. So for BYU, even though they may not be the most talented, they could end up being a little bit better than what some people expect them to be because of their style of play. And some of those Big 12 teams that they match up against this year, they may not be able to handle it. But I think that Gus Malzahn and the UCF Knights are going to have the most success out of all of the new Big 12 teams that are going into this conference. UCF has done a pretty good job utilizing the transfer portal. The recruiting has elevated a little bit under Gus Malzahn, and they do have a really good quarterback in John Rhys Plumlee, which is something that you definitely look in that you look at when you're trying to determine how successful a team's going to be, especially when they're making a jump from a G5 conference to a Power 5 conference. So I'm going with UCF to be the team that I think is going to have the most success in 2023.